Hi everyone, good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming. So tonight we have a special guest with us, a speaker from the UK, Dr. Mark Rowe. We're going to have a book presentation of his recently published biography about the philosopher J.L. Austin. I'm not going to talk a lot as part of this introduction. We want to leave as much as time as possible for you also to ask questions to Mark about the book or whatever you want to ask about life and work of J.L. Austin. So I'm going to tell just a few bits about Mark. So he is an honorary research fellow from University of East Anglia. He also worked there as a senior lecturer for several years. That's how I also met Mark as a PhD student a while ago. Mark published many books and articles. He's interested in philosophy, contributed to philosophy of art and literature. He's also written another biography, right, on a I don't know, this
He's
violinist.
a 19th century violinist and composer.
19th century violinist. He's called Heinrich
Wilhelm Ernst. Yes, that's right.
Wilhelm Ernst, yes. So, so this biography that he wrote about J.L. Austin is not his first biography ever. I will now give floor to my, by the way, I'm Tamara Dobler, I'm a philosopher, but I'm going to give floor to my colleague from English Literature Department, who will also say a few things about his connection to Mark, and then Mark will kick off.
Yes, and yeah, to what Tamara has already said, I'd just like to add an expressly warm welcome from the English faculty and students. And I thought it might interest you to hear that to us English literature scholars at the UFA, Mark is not only a philosopher and biographer, but also an accomplished colleague. Today is the first time I've met him in person, but for more than 10 years by now, we've used a chapter from his 2004 book, Philosophy and Literature, as staple reading in our English MA core course. And yeah, our students know it as the Duck Rabbit essay. In that chapter, Mark marvelously clarifies the fundamentals of what we literary critics do when we critique literary works. And although Austin himself does not yet appear in the piece, Mark's style of argumentation and late Wittgensteinian approach already very much breathe the spirit of his speech act theory. To get our conversation started, can I first ask you, Mark, to tell us a bit more about your book? What makes Austin's life and thought such a noteworthy subject in your view? What questions were you hoping to answer when researching the book? And which of your many findings strike you as most significant and perhaps also surprising?
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Perhaps for the people who haven't heard about Austin before, I'll very briefly sketch Austin's career and what's generally known about him, and then I'll go back and talk about some of the things which I hope are new about the book. So J.L. Austin was born in Lancaster in 1911 to a family of architects. His father goes off to fight in the First World War and has a fairly terrible time. He comes back actually in 1919, and there's no architectural work. Okay, so he has to find a new job. So he gets a job as a school bursar, the man in charge of school finances in St Andrews in Scotland, and the whole family moves up with him. There are eventually five Austin children. Austin goes to the local little prep school just down the road and begins to do brilliantly. He's clearly, from about the age of 6, it's clearly that he's academically exceptional. He goes to this little school and wins an open scholarship to Shrewsbury College in England, which is one of the sort of top independent public schools. He's 2 years younger than most of his contemporaries, but again, he does absolutely outstandingly brilliantly, and he ends by winning an open scholarship to Balliol College, Oxford, one of the top academic prizes. Goes to Balliol, again, does fantastically well, gets a first, gets alphas on all his papers, all his tutors agreed, you know, this guy is absolutely outstanding. And he emphasizes just how outstanding he is. He then wins a prize fellowship to All Souls. All Souls College in Oxford is basically, it's a purely research institution. You don't do any teaching. So obviously it's the tops, everybody wants to go there. And he wins an examination fellowship, which means he gets 7 years of doing, you can do whatever he likes, and you can do pure research. So he works there, but after 2 years, the 1930s is a difficult time for academics as any others. He thinks, I need to get a permanent job, okay? So he takes a tutorial fellowship at Magdalen College, Oxford, where he has a discussion group where he begins to formulate his own characteristic views. Then the Second World War occurs. He's just met the woman who's about to be his wife, a woman called Jean Coots, and he has to go off to training. So he goes to Aldershot to do his military training. He's picked out as someone who's clearly been outstandingly good at military intelligence. He's sent off to Matlock to do an intelligence training course, and also to make sure that his German is up to scratch and so forth. Then joins the intelligence services. Initially, he's working on intelligence in the North Africa section, where initially the British were fighting the Italians, but the Italians were rather badly beaten early on, and the Germans under Rommel came across with the Africa Corps to sustain them. Does some very important work there and makes 1 or 2 observations that pick him out as a brilliant intelligence officer. Perhaps we can talk about this a little bit later on. But his main contribution in the war is he's put in charge of a small unit at the beginning of 1942, which is designed to to do coastal intelligence on the French coast, the purpose being to decide, at some point we've got to reinvade the continent, we've got to have continental landings. Where are we going to land? How are we going to arrange this? And he does some exceptionally brilliant work, which again I'll describe in more detail perhaps later on, deciding where the landing must take place. After that, he flies across. He does intelligence for prior to Arnhem, which is obviously a very contentious battle. And there's some suggestion there were intelligence failures here, which again I'll talk about a bit more later on. At the end, in Germany, he's demilitarizing the German army. He's collecting German documents for eventually for the Nuremberg trials. He's kept on for a few months after the end of the Second World War, goes back to teaching in Oxford at the end of 1945 and begins to actually start teaching in 1946. And it's here that his characteristic philosophy develops, which is called ordinary language philosophy. And basically what ordinary language philosophy is, in some sense it's traditional. It's what Socrates was doing when he asked questions like what is piety, what is courage, and so forth. But the ideology behind ordinary language philosophy is the idea that ordinary philosophical problems are in a sense pseudo-problems. They simply look like problems. And the reason is because philosophers subtly misuse ordinary language terms, get into a kind of terrible muddle with them and start having to produce these sort of elaborate Baroque structures to explain the muddle they've got into. And the point of ordinary language philosophy is, let's look at how these terms are actually used in real life, and then you'll find that these problems are dissolved. Okay? So he does this, and he's extremely influential. He's a very forceful personality, and really pushed this line and began to get disciples and people who worked on it. And of course, people who hated the disciples and his work, and so factions begin to develop in the normal way. In 1955, however, he's asked to lecture at Harvard. And he presents a series of lectures he'd worked on for some time called How to Do Things with Words, which is about speech acts, which again, we can talk a little bit more later on. Loves America, is invited again to Berkeley in 1959, then on a tour of Scandinavia, where he spends most of his time talking about speech acts, which is what he's most remembered for. At the end of his Scandinavian trip, he notices he's becoming unusually tired. He's becoming exhausted by fairly ordinary things. He goes home. The doctor isn't initially terribly concerned, but the symptoms persist. He begins to sweat at night. There's much concern because clearly he had a wife, quite an introverted woman, who basically looked to him for a lead in everything. As I said, there were 5 children, 4 children. Yes, he had 4 children himself. They're quite young. They're between the ages of 9 and 17. So he takes himself off to radiography at the local hospital, receives a letter back saying, there's some anomalies here that we need to look at. And it soon becomes pretty clear that he's got seriously advanced lung cancer. And basically, because he was young, within 2 or 3 months of his diagnosis, he's dead. And this is just before his 49th birthday, he's 48. So effectively, Austin only had a 30-year career, both in military intelligence and in philosophy. But he's still, we will talk perhaps a bit later about why he's thought important, but his life is tragically cut short in 1960. So perhaps I'll leave that there as my initial exposition. If I have to say what I hope is new about the book, basically, the only biographical study of Austin is by a man called Geoffrey Warnock, and it was written in 1963, and nobody's done any further biographical research on him, apart from me, since 1963. So I have expanded an 18-page essay by Warnock into a book which I regret to say is about 350,000 words long. Even I was quite taken aback how huge it is. So there's a great mass of detail. If I have to pick out some things which I hope are new, one of the things is, before the war, I think he was influenced by American pragmatist philosophy. I mean, there are a number of major influences here. Oxford realism, the influence of Wittgenstein is coming across from Cambridge, which I'll perhaps explain later. But pragmatism is kind of new, and Austin encountered the form of C.I. Lewis, so I think it's important. About his war work, there was only 5 paragraphs in print. So one of the main points of writing the book was to write a long central section, the middle 12 chapters, about exactly what he did. And I will go into this in more detail, but it's his work on North Africa, and it's his work on D-Day, and some of the work he did towards the end on the Nuremberg trials and so forth are very important and significant contributions to the war and winning the war in the West. You know, Austin is one of the central figures in this. He's been entirely unknown in this role, but I think he was one of the great intelligence philosophers of the war, and it's fairly easy to demonstrate that he made an absolutely seminal contribution. After the war, Austin always liked to present his philosophy as absolutely complete. He didn't develop, he was always consistent, he got it more or less right first time. He was a man who didn't like to admit that he changed his mind, especially in public. I think his progress was not particularly smooth. I think he started after the war being influenced by Wittgenstein, and then decided, I think he thought it was a bit belittling to be someone's disciple, so he'd better move away from that and do something else. He tries to revive some of the philosophy he knew in the 1920s and 30s, in the early 1950s, with work on truth, which I don't think was entirely successful. And eventually, he begins to synthesize Wittgenstein and pragmatism in his work on speech acts, which again, I'll talk about. And finally, he began to work on something called sound symbolism, which is another new, well, it's not a new theory, but it was a very old and apparently outmoded theory in the philosophy of language. He was very keen on it, much to the horror of several of his contemporaries, and began to write about that topic. And it's never been, it's mentioned on his Wikipedia page, but that's the only place you can actually find any information on it. So I managed to find lots of the Austin papers were kept in his widow's garage roof for 30 years. So I have several large boxes of papers in absolutely disgusting condition, but were damp and mouldy, and mice had been crapping on for many years, and I had to wear rubber gloves and a mask and sort of disinfect these things. But unfortunately, I did find some work on his sound symbolism, and I thought, my work is rewarded because here is this stuff. And I've tried to reconstruct as best I can this work on sound symbolism, which was contentious even at the time. So that's a rough outline of who Austin is, and as a rough outline of some of the new things which are in the book. So I'll leave it there for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. So I have a question about a relationship between Wittgenstein and Austin. So I'm a Wittgensteinian, yes. and I learn about Austin and Austin's idea as something that is very similar to Wittgenstein, right? So it kind of almost, it puts in a clearer way some of the ideas that are already there, yes, in Wittgenstein's work. But that's not so clear-cut, right, historically, yes, right? Yeah. So in your book, you mentioned that Austin never kind of owned his attachment to Wittgenstein or any kind of influence, yes, from Wittgenstein, although you also argue that there is indeed such a connection. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, Wittgenstein has basically 2 philosophies. The first one was published in his book, The Tractatus, which I think appeared in 1921, and the translation perhaps a year later, which we needn't go into, but it's based on logic, is basically the idea. He thought logic was the fundamental topic. Wittgenstein felt he'd solved all philosophical problems with the Tractatus, so naturally at that point retired, and he became a school teacher in central Austria, and he worked at that job for a number of years. During those years, he still had conversations with a number of philosophers, like Frank Ramsey, for example, is a good example. And Wittgenstein's views began to substantially change. And they began to change towards this idea of ordinary language philosophy, which I've already described, where what you have to do is diagnose early how philosophers are misusing words, and then these pseudo-problems won't get off the ground. A number of people persuade Wittgenstein that he ought to come back to Cambridge and start working on these topics, because this is a kind of new and exciting development. So Wittgenstein comes back to Cambridge in 1929. He begins to lecture, he begins to talk, he acquires pupils. Now, if you read, there's a famous essay by Isaiah Berlin called J.L. Austin and the Beginnings of Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophy, where Berlin tries to make clear that the discussion group in All Souls, 6 of them, talking about modern ideas, particularly about logical positivism, were not influenced by Wittgenstein. Oxford Ordinary Language began to emerge from this discussion before the war, but he says none of us actually read any Wittgenstein or knew what was really going on. I find this explanation incredible, because basically Wittgenstein moves to Cambridge in 1929. The discussion group starts at the beginning of 1937 and carries on to 1939. Many Cambridge philosophers and Wittgenstein disciples were coming across to talk about Wittgenstein's ideas in Oxford, like Braithwaite and John Wisdom, for example. Many Oxford philosophers were going back to Cambridge, like Gilbert Ryle, for example, who actually says, I was a disciple of Wittgenstein throughout the 1930s. So the idea that Austin didn't know in general what Wittgenstein was doing for the first 9 years is extraordinary. Also, Berlin says there were 2 famous Wittgenstein manuscripts named after the covers of the folders in which they were kept. They were referred to as the Blue Book and the Brown Book. Okay? They're typescripts. They're dictated by Wittgenstein. Berlin says these started to circulate in Oxford from 1937 onwards. Well, who was reading these manuscripts that were circulating in Oxford? I would think, the young philosophers who were very interested in Wittgenstein and recognized that Wittgenstein was the major philosopher of the age. And it's incredible, the idea that none of these young Turks working on Wittgenstein's topic had read any Wittgenstein. So that strikes me as extraordinary. Also, it's also worth pointing out that Berlin and Gilbert Ryle did not get on. They disliked one another. Gilbert Ryle is extremely important in post-war Oxford linguistic philosophy. Gilbert Ryle is not mentioned except once, just en passant. This major role is just not, because Berlin cuts it out. The other reason, I think, is not only that Austin knew what was going on and had read some of these manuscripts. In February 1940, one of his last papers before the war, he went across to Cambridge and gave a paper called The Meaning of a Word, which he chose never to publish. But in the book, and I won't go through it in detail, but I give, there are half a dozen passages at least, parallel passages between the Blue Book in particular and this essay of Austin's. So the obvious reason why there are these parallels is because Austin had read this manuscript of Wittgenstein. Austin hated acknowledging being influenced. He thought there was, it was a sort of inferior position. He was not interested in that at all. He comes back after the war. His ideas are very similar to some of Wittgenstein's. He never says, I'm not influenced by Wittgenstein. He just does things like, he pretends he can't remember Wittgenstein's name. That chap, he refers to him as poor Witters. Or on another occasion, he refers to him as just another Austrian philosopher. Now, it's true that their styles are immensely different. Basically, Wittgenstein, despite being interested in very detailed work on ordinary language, is very romantic, he's tortured, he has disciples, he's very individualistic, he's basically the paradigm of what a philosophical genius is supposed to look like. Austin is contemptuous after the war of the whole idea of the individual philosophical genius. Austin, after the war, believes basically philosophical problems should be solved like intelligence problems. You get a committee, you think about it, you produce a report and so forth. So this Wittgensteinian stuff where you tear out your hair, you stutter, you agonize, you stay awake all night because you're wrestling with these questions. He just thinks it's absurdly theatrical. So Austin never says, I am not influenced, but their styles are very obvious. He's very contemptuous, and it's actually Austin's, people writing about Austin who say there's no influence. His disciple Geoffrey Warnock says there was no influence. Similarly, John Searle, writing later, says their styles were so different there can be no influence. Well, their styles are very different, but nonetheless, the basic idea of ordinary language is one and the same. Austin was nervous about this. I mean, for example, his disciple Stanley Cavell writes about going to a seminar with Austin, and he says, Wittgenstein is on Austin's mind, but he's trying not to think about him. I think there's real kind of anxiety of influence there. He knows perfectly well that at some stage, yes, he has got some ideas from Wittgenstein. Instead of saying, yes, like every other philosopher in the US, in the UK, Australia, I was influenced by Wittgenstein, he finds it awkward to acknowledge. So it's actually the fact that the influence is so close that makes him want to reject it. It's rather like A.J. Ayer, who obviously influenced philosopher Austin very deeply at one point. He has to be rejected. And it's not as violent in Wittgenstein's case, it's just as, that chap, whatever his name was, did some stuff, but it's ridiculous.
Really hate
Yes. So, as I say, yes, I think he was influenced by Wittgenstein. Was he happy to own up to it? Not really, no. I mean, I think somebody put this very accurately. I think Austin is a great figure, I think he's important, but somebody said, he's a large wave on Wittgenstein's second tide, which puts the matter very nicely. Wittgenstein had two philosophies, both philosophies deeply influenced European and American philosophy. When he changed, there was a huge upheavals and everybody began to fall in line. He's the sort of, the change maker of the era. Everybody's interested in Wittgenstein. Austin is not happy completely to acknowledge this, but he did develop things and things in more detail that Wittgenstein himself didn't develop. So perhaps I'll leave that argument there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I have a question about the war.
Yes.
Why would I mention it? Yeah. That ultimately aims at. I'd like to understand the way you describe the way you describe Austin's life is that it consists basically of these two parts, right? These two careers, a war career and quite an illustrious one, and at the same time also the academic career. Yeah. I wonder whether you see connections between the two of them, an influence perhaps there that he is maybe even happy to acknowledge.
Yes.
But to know that, I want to know first, what do you think is his great achievement? What is this amazing war achievement?
Right, I'll describe what I think he did in the war. Yes, first of all, he goes off to a group called MI14, which is working on the war in North Africa, where initially the British are fighting the Italians. The Italians are badly defeated. Austin had just joined the section when this was about to happen. He's a trainee. He's had flu. He's feeling under the weather. He turns up and he's given very boring work. As a trainee intelligence officer, you have to read your way into the war, which means basically you're given piles of German magazines to thumb through to see if they contain any photographs that might give away positions of guns or new technology or something. And he said, I did this for hours and you find nothing, because obviously the Germans are quite careful about that kind of thing. You have to read minutes of meetings. You have to read material on aerial photography or whatever. So he's up the back and he's doing badly. And they actually had an exercise early in the war that he said, I've done terribly, it's gone rather badly. And everybody at the time was concentrating on what's Hitler's next major move. Is he going to try and have another go at invading the UK? Is he going to pick some other target? Could that be Russia? So all the discussions of this. Other people aren't really paying attention to the other theatres, and why should they? Because the Italians are one of the few successes of the British Army early in the war. Then what happened with Austin, and I've managed to reconstruct this from various remarks from colleagues, autobiographies, and from Austin's own letters. What Austin does is he's looking at some aerial photographs of the Bay of Naples. He's looking at some radio traffic. He's looking at sort of various bits of information coming in. And he thinks there seems to be a large sort of German concentration in the Bay of Naples. There seem to be some large and heavy ships there, for example. And there's one or two reports of sort of German columns moving down Italy. I wonder what could be happening. And he suddenly realizes the Italians are badly beaten. And what happens is the Germans are going to move in and help them. And what's happening is that Rommel and the Africa Corps are moving down Italy in order to take convoys across, and there were sort of 8 or 9 convoys of ships carrying tanks and mechanized equipment across to North Africa. And Austin sends out a memo to this effect from MI14, which completely jiggered the most senior people in the country who thought, the Italians are soundly bitten. And oh God, the Germans are moving in with a very advanced, highly mechanized force. This is disastrous. This is something we just hadn't foreseen at all. They were supposed to be attacking somewhere else, Russia. So I think Austin's major insight, just as a junior trainee, as a part-time basis, he'd been there 5 weeks, was to spot this major strategic change in German strategy. And obviously, the battle in North Africa was a fairly terrifying conflict for the next couple of years, and it was a real struggle to defeat, to eventually defeat Rommel effectively in 1943. So that's the first thing he does. I think also it was that Austin produced excellent quality intelligence, which Auchinleck and his brigadier in charge of intelligence basically ignored. And they were then soundly beaten by Rommel again. And the British High Command thought, we must get rid of Auchinleck and Shearer, they're not doing a good job. We must replace them with somebody else. And eventually they were replaced with Montgomery and a man called de Guingand, Freddie de Guingand, who was a brilliant intelligence officer. And of course, as we know, it was the team of Montgomery and de Guingand that eventually beat Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein. So, and it was on the basis of ignoring Austin's excellent intelligence that this new team was put in place. And as Churchill said, up till El Alamein, we never had a victory. After El Alamein, we never had a defeat. It's the turning point of the war. It's just before the Battle of Stalingrad was concluded. It's a much smaller scale battle. In North Africa, you're dealing with 5, 6 divisions at most. In the Battle of Stalingrad, you're dealing with 185, 200 divisions. It's a massive battle. But Austin helped, his intelligence was so good, he got the team sacked and a proper team was put in, which won the Battle of El Alamein. So that's his contribution in North Africa. His contribution to D-Day was he was put in charge, having done well in North Africa, he's put in charge of this very small section in charge of the French coast. He turns out to be incredibly well organized. He started off as only 5 or 6 people. He turned them into specialists. He would disseminate information, the specialists would investigate and discuss. Austin would take it in, they would talk about it, they would produce a report called the Martian Report. This was disseminated to everybody else. He turned out he had a bit of a genius for seeing how intelligence fitted together and, equally important, how it should be disseminated. To pick one very important thing he did, they were thinking about where on earth can we invade? Where's the best place to invade? The obvious place is the Pas de Calais, which is the Straits of Dover. It's only 22 miles away from England. It was also thought perhaps we should spread the landings out widely, because then the Germans can't just attack one bit and knock that bit out. So that was the general thought. Austin takes over, and a group called ISTD, the Inter-Services Topographical Unit, had produced a map of the physical geography of the French coast. And there are certain criteria for having an effective landing. For example, that our landing craft can beach easily. Basically, the beach can't be too flat. You must have good beach exits, because there's no point in having tanks just stuck on the beach you can't get off. So they investigate in enormous detail what's the correct physical place to land. And ISTD produced a great big wall map of the entire French coast showing, I think it was red for good. If I remember, it was blue for fair and green for poor. So they put this thing up, and you can see there are 3 red areas. These are possible places we can land. What Austin then did was his particular team was concerned with German man-made defences, minefields, tank traps, anti-tank guns, that kind of stuff, coastal guns. And his team then produced the same map, colour-coded, to say where the German defences are strong and where they're weak. Okay, so you put these 2 huge maps together, and it's quite clear that if you're looking for the red sections, there is one red section where the 2 maps intersect, and that is the Bay of the Seine from roughly Caen going west to the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, which is the peninsula on which Cherbourg is the very head. And he publishes both of these maps in Martian reports in July 1942. So what he's effectively done is he's completed a kind of visual proof of where we must land. He didn't have the seniority to say, we're going to land here, because obviously he's only a major at that stage, possibly even a captain at that point. But what he did do was set out the intelligence in such a way as to make the decision of where to land to try and recapture France a no-brainer. You think, there's one place we can land, and that's there. So already 2 years ahead of D-Day, he's basically decided effectively where the D-Day landing is going to take place. Now, if he'd cocked up that decision, if it had gone wrong, if he'd done it badly, it would have been catastrophic. They had no plan B. You know, they had terrible difficulties arranging D-Day. If that had gone wrong, I won't say Germany would never be defeated, but the war could have easily lasted another 2 years, and that would have led to hundreds of thousands of more deaths. So that was a really brilliant insight, I think, about where to land. Also, just the sheer quality of all the detailed intelligence pushing out, briefings and producing maps and guidebooks. And when Bill Williams, who was the man in charge, was Montgomery's intelligence chief to the 21st Army Group, which was the group that actually did the invasion, when he was asked, why was D-Day a success, he said, Austin, more than anybody, was responsible for the life-saving accuracy of the D-Day intelligence. And this is actually backed up by 2 official reports at the time, which say, because they wanted to know why were our landings in Italy, in many cases like Anzio and so forth, really weren't very successful at all. What did we do, or Dieppe, which was terrible in 1942, what did we do right at D-Day? And these 2 official reports say, because the intelligence was so good. And again, they ascribed responsibility to ISTD, which is the physical geography people, and also to Austin's TIS. Because, because we knew where the machine guns were and what kind of mines there were and where the German reserves were, we were able to win. So it was this that was so extraordinary. I mean, that's his major contribution. Now, to go on to the second, I won't go into...
Did he already do things with words?
Yes,
aerial photographs?
Yes, he did. Yes. So he was masterful at aerial photographs. He was incredibly good at interpreting aerial photographs. I will give you, perhaps in the discussion, I'll give you some examples. But anyway, just to apply to this, the second part of your question, how did he apply this to philosophy? Well, early in the war, there's a letter to his wife which says, well, here I am working in intelligence. Normally, when I used to work in philosophy, basically I was working on imponderables. I came up with large, vague answers. Nobody was at all interested in them, and nothing basically depended on it at all. And I'm horrified to discover, I'm asked these questions. There's a right answer and a wrong answer, and it's easy to see which. And if I get it wrong, thousands of men are killed. I have to get this stuff absolutely right. So he says, it's a bit of a shock for me being, a research philosopher. This is a shame. And obviously he came out of the war and thought, well, why don't I apply the methods that have been so successful in intelligence to philosophy? I mean, for example, there's these romantic philosopher individualists who sit in garrets and lofts and attics and write long works called Phenomenology of Spirit or whatever. Why do it like that? Why not do it like in intelligence, where you think there's this serious problem, it is solvable, we'll get together a team, we'll divide them into specialists, I will collate what's going on, I will help them, and why not produce papers in science, like, with 12 names beneath the title, possibly? Or why do we have to have names under it at all? Why don't we just get together and have reports? Because what normally happens is a philosopher writes a paper and then everybody piles in and criticizes it and says, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. He says, why don't we get in early and have all the criticisms first, get those all sorted out, and then publish a paper? So what he does when he goes back to Oxford is he sets up a little... I mean, I want to say, actually, perhaps I should have said earlier, that his 6 or 7 men at the beginning of the war, Austin was so effective, it ended up before D-Day somewhere between 300 and 500 men. It was a really huge section. It had the top floors of a large London department store were given over to the theatre intelligence section. Anyway, he goes to Oxford and he thinks, right, well, I'm going to apply these methods to philosophy. So he has these Saturday mornings where he invites... They're not graduates and they're not colleagues, they're the young teachers of philosophy. They're basically people between kind of 22 and 32, perhaps. The young teaching hacks, as he refers to them. We'll get, a dozen of them or 20 of them, and we'll get a philosophical problem, and we will work on it. So there's a lot of interest after the Second World War, largely through Wittgenstein, on what's a rule of language, for example. What's special about linguistic rules? And Austin decides, well, we don't know much about rules. Let's have a really good look at rules. So, for example, they spent a year, 1947 to 48, their first year, looking at rules and games. They thought this would be brilliant. Let's really work out what these things are. And Herbert Hart, who later became famous, anybody who studied law, you might have come across the work of Herbert Hart, who wrote the concept of law and that kind of stuff. His job as a junior teacher was to go and research baseball, Go and find everything you can about baseball. I want to know about the goals of baseball. I want to know about the rules of baseball. I want to know about the etiquette of baseball, everything. So Hart said, at the end of this year, I knew more about baseball than anybody in the world. And obviously other people were sent off to research Monopoly or, children's dressing up games or make-believe games or Ring-a-Ring-a Roses, which, they're very disparate things, games. It's not obvious how they fit together at all. And they basically discussed for a year, initially writing minutes and so forth, what a game was and what a rule of a game was and what the sheer variety of these things was.
I love that.
Yeah, I like it.
That's such a good way of doing philosophy. That's so novel, actually.
Yes, it was.
Where does the philosophy come in? Descriptions of games is one thing, right?
Well, I think, but the first thing to say is, as Austin often said, linguistic philosophy has always been part of philosophy. So Socrates asked questions like, what is courage? What is piety? What is, these kind of what is questions have always been there. And those are basically linguistic questions. So in a sense, Austin wanted to say, these are philosophical questions. They've always been around. In a sense, but what's new is this very systematic method, doing it with a committee, doing it with young people, trying to not take these old stale chestnuts of philosophical problems like, is there free will, or, sort of, is utilitarianism correct? The kind of thing everybody writes essays on. Let's look at, as I say, things like rules of language. The second year's project was signs and symbols. What is a symbol? What is a sign? What's special about words? And they worked on that. So the result of his intelligence work in the war was this completely new, basically committee-focused way, a rather oral method initially, actually, of doing philosophy. I should say that I think the results were not quite as impressive as Austin hoped. And by the late 1950s, his meetings, they've stopped taking minutes, and they've stopped having reports, and people, they've stopped having specialists. And it becomes a kind of much more relaxed and conventional Socratic kind of thing. And people by that stage were beginning to think, well, this method hasn't produced quite the results we were hoping for, and they begin to write more traditional kind of philosophy, like Strawson's Individuals, for example, it's a famous case, or Stuart Hampshire's Thought and Action, once again going back to more traditional problems. But it was worth a go. Perhaps the method was too romantic and individualist. So he explored it, and it did produce some quite interesting results. And at least we can now see, well, perhaps that was a bit of a cul-de-sac, but we now know it's a cul-de-sac, and we can now perhaps head off in another direction.
It surely affected the individuals who took part in these sessions.
Oh, it certainly did.
It impacted their work, their philosophy, way they did things with words.
I think so, yes. And certainly people, I mean, perhaps I should explain why I think that perhaps linguistic philosophy and ordinary language philosophy is a bit of a misleading title. Because one thing to say about linguistic philosophy is not really about words. For example, I give this case to everybody. I'm like the ancient mariner with this example because I like it so much. I stop people and tell it to them. Which is, Austin actually doesn't give very good explanations of why he's doing linguistic philosophy. He says things like, well, words are tools and we need clean tools, or they're like blinkers, or they're like lenses. And basically, it's entirely at the level of metaphor, his explanations. And the metaphors actually pull in the opposite direction of his argument, because it looks like words are over here, they're blinkers, they're tools, or whatever, and reality is over here. And people want to say, well, why are we bothered with words? Why don't we just talk about reality? Well, surely that's a much better way to go about it. And Austin really didn't give any very satisfactory answers to this, and I think hated talking about philosophical method. He didn't want to talk about his method because he didn't really have any satisfactory answers, which weren't really, nobody really came up with it until Stanley Cavell, his American disciple. And Cavell comes up with this wonderful example. He says, you're reading a book of memoirs and you come across the word umiak. And you think, well, what does that mean? And he says, you go and look it up in the dictionary, and it says an umiak is a kind of Eskimo canoe made of wood and leather. And then Cavell says, what have you discovered? Have you discovered what the word umiak means, or have you discovered what an umiak is? And you think, well, that's sort of the same, actually. If you basically, now I know the meaning. And you say, when I've learnt the meaning of the word umiak, you can now say, you turn to me and say, what is an umiak? And I say, well, it's a kind of Inuit canoe. It's made from wood and leather and all this kind of stuff. And actually, it's the same. And Cavell generalizes this point very nicely by saying, well, ordinary language philosophy isn't about ordinary language, it's about whatever ordinary language is about. And so when you do Austin stuff about, discovering a mistake or discovering an accent, you're not just discovering what those words mean. In some sense, you're discovering what a mistake or what an accent actually is. So it's misleading to think, you're talking about words rather than language, because in certain respects, there are some respects in which talking about a word is actually talking about reality. So some of the things Austin did, the explanations are actually better than Austin himself gave. And I think Cavell sort of really puts his finger on something. His is the liberating word. It's an incredibly simple explanation. But somehow people found it difficult to give, and it just suddenly becomes perspicuous.
Yeah. Shall we open for the floor, right?
Yeah, sure.
We have 20-ish more minutes left, so I think it's a good time for you to ask your questions if you have some. And we
can include clarification questions, of course.
Or things we haven't talked about at all, or whatever you like. Yeah.
And we don't assume everyone's a specialist in speech activity.
Yes.
Are there any?
I like Austin's... Oh, sorry, thanks. Yeah. I like Austin's writing a lot, and it's influenced me a lot, but it's not very inviting. And I get the feeling like his influence is not fully explained by his publications or what he wrote as a form of dissemination. So clearly it came from somewhere else, and at least in part. So I was wondering, what do you think was the source of his influence? What was he like as a person that was kind of persuasive to others or appealing to them?
I think you're right. Austin, in his lifetime, only published only 7 papers. Okay, in the collected papers, this becomes 10. But he wrote very little and was aware of writing very little. And part of that is explained from the fact that he thought of basically philosophy was philosophical dialogue. It was something fundamentally, it's an oral activity. Okay, just like in ancient Greece. Also, it must be said, Oxford. There was a long tradition of not publishing stuff. Oxford had an idea that if you publish it, this is supposed to be your last word on the topic. People were intimidated by the fact that you published something and then people criticise it, so they thought, let's not publish anything. So Oxford has a tradition of not publishing. But you're right. And I will say also that Austin's writing is very inviting. Perhaps we'll talk about this a bit, or we can talk about it a bit later on, but his style is very distinctive, and you instantly know this is a paragraph from Austin. But his influence came about from the fact that, in some respects, he was a slightly terrifying individual. People were rather terrified by him. He was quite prepared to be rude in public. If you were in an inferior position, if you were a pupil, if you're a junior colleague, if you're just a young member of his family, he was unfailingly courteous. He was very, very nice to you. And people in that position often thought Austin was absolutely terrific. They thought he was wonderful. He was just the nonpareil amongst philosophy teachers. If, on the other hand, you were on a parity with him or his superior, then you could expect trouble. Especially in public. He was not going to be shown to be beaten in public. He was very good at raising a laugh against a questioner in the audience. He could turn the rest of the audience against any questioner quite easily, and was quite prepared to be very cutting. There's one very nice example in the war, which I'll give you, which shows how difficult he was with senior people. That in January 1944, he had to give a presentation at Bletchley Park to Eisenhower, newly arrived, and the entire American general staff, and lots of British senior officers, all generals. Austin gave a presentation about the slope of the beach at Arromanches, which was very important for the landings to work successfully. They'd done some very detailed reconnaissance raids and so forth. Austin, somebody said, who was there at the time, said, Austin spoke unsmilingly and to the point. At the end of which, an American lieutenant general stood up and questioned one or two things Austin had said. So Austin, who was at that time a major, said, you senior American officers are all the same. It's not that you try to run before you can walk, it's you will try to walk before you can stand up. This was absolutely astonishing. This is to Eisenhower. This is to the general of staff. And apparently the Americans said, "Oh, they winced. They kind of blushed. They said, oh, sorry. I didn't realize it." So this kind of slightly terrifying rudeness could be accessed if Austin felt in any way challenged in a public context, especially by superiors. And Geoffrey Warnock has a nice passage at the end of which is in a book called, what was it called? It's a little penguin book. No, the Fly and Fly Bottle, that's right. About how philosophers in England were haunted by Austin's presence. You know, they write a paragraph and then they imagine Austin reading it over in his rather frigid, inhuman voice, and they would wilt and decided they weren't going to publish that paragraph after all. And just to give you a few other examples, you know, he got some real enemies in Oxford. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, for example, used to refer to him as the bastard, you know, because and he referred to her as the ninny, you know this kind of stuff. So, and another just the case that comes to mind was Geoffrey Warnock, who was a disciple of Austin's, read a short paper at the beginning of a seminar on free will, and so he finished his paper, and there was a silence, and Austin said, "Well, what are we to make of that pathetic little rigmarole?" So he could be absolutely devastating. And he was very, very clever. He was very intelligent. He was very witty. It made people laugh. But, you know, he wasn't a man to sort of, you know, not wield the blade effectively if he felt the moment had come. And people were frightened of him. And Ryle actually said, you know, we were all frightened of him, though very few of us had the courage to admit it. And, you know, he began to get a real iron grip on, I mean, there were some quite unpleasant things said by Noel Annan, who wrote a book called The Dons and worked with Austin during the war. Annan said, "Oh yes, Austin, the Robespierre of linguistic philosophy," you know, and somebody else said, you know, he was like Stalin and so forth. You know, he was the cold, cutting committee man when necessary. So it's basically, it's partly that he had good ideas, and it's true in his work on his new kind of philosophical method, people liked his papers, but he did have this slightly terrifying aspect to his personality, and people were in awe of him. And it's rather notable, I think, that on his death, most of his ideas about how to do philosophy and so forth tended to dissipate. People began to regard those as, you know, yesterday's ideas. But his work on speech acts has survived and has flourished. And I think this situation is partly because, in some ways, his personality was more forceful than his ideas. You know, and once that very forceful personality had been withdrawn, very suddenly, very unexpectedly, people no sooner knew that he was ill than he was dead. He just disappeared. And he had been the totally dominating force in Oxford for 14 years. He'd just gone. So basically, you know, that's a very interesting question. I think it wasn't on the basis of his publications, it was on the basis of his oral performance in seminars, but there was this additional fact of he could be a rather terrifying figure, and people were slightly scared of him, and you know, even after his death, and Daniel Dennett gave me a nice description of going to an Oxford seminar, you know, after Austin's death, and Oxford dons couldn't ask a straight question. You know, they'd say things like, to put it over simply, you know, one could think about possibly raising some objection to the effect that, you know, they couldn't ask. It had to be terribly caveats and qualifications. They couldn't ask direct questions because somebody would think Austin would leap on them and sort of snatch them, and they would be wiped out. So he you know, he could be very sweet. He was very loving. He was very charming. He was obviously a wonderful husband. His wife absolutely adored him, as did his children and all the junior colleagues and so on. Many students, you know, Thomas Nagel, Pitcher, all sorts of people. Cavell adored him, but he could be terrifying. And it's partly down to that committee man's terror that he had this grip on Oxford.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Just two very quick questions. How well versed was Austin in foreign languages?
Yeah.
And secondly, what did he do in his spare time, if he had any?
Okay. Foreign languages, clearly he was, at school he studied virtually nothing but classics, and he regretted, you know, not doing maths or science for the rest of his life. But he was exceptionally fluent in Greek and Latin. You know, he could just knock off an ode by Ovid or whatever it was, you know, without problems. He'd done this in innumerable exams. So that was his main. His French was very good, and then he actually, before the war, he had a French girlfriend. His first girlfriend was actually his sister's nanny, who was French. She was from Bordeaux. They had a slightly secret affair for about 4 years before the war. So he spoke French with her all the time. So by the time the war arrived, his French was completely fluent. He'd gone to Germany in 1932 and 33. interestingly, to one family whose their family business had been virtually wiped out by the Depression and were very sympathetic to Nazism. And the next year to a German military and diplomatic family in Berlin who were opposed to Hitler and thought Hitler was a sort of was a thug and, was to be treated, with great caution. And he learnt German primarily because he was a classicist, and most of the great commentaries on the classics are in German. If you're a classicist, you basically have to be able to read German. So that's why he did it. He had some Russian. He visited Russia in 1934. He was very good friends with Isaiah Berlin, who was a native Russian speaker. One of Austin's friends was a man called Frank Friedeberg Seely, who was a brilliant linguist and also became a professional Russianist. And Austin, on entering the army, says, "I speak some Russian." Because he was a young socialist before the war, he was a keen supporter of the democratic side in the Spanish Civil War and thought he ought to be able to read Spanish newspapers directly, so he was getting news directly from Spain. And his sister told me, actually, that he never studied any Spanish, but his sister said, "Well, I'm learning Spanish at school, here's my textbook." And she then went for a long walk, 3 hours, came back, and Austin had a pretty good conversation with her in Spanish. It had taken him 3 hours to pick up, passable primitive Spanish, And he said, basically, and so he spoke fluent French. In addition to Greek and Latin, he spoke fluent French and German. And he spoke some Russian, some Italian, some Spanish. Good enough to read, in the case of certainly in Italian, but not enough to speak. So he was a very able linguist, is the answer to that. What was this? Oh, what did he do in his spare time? Well, I think one of the things Mary Warnock said about him was, in a way, he was very brilliant, but he was sort of quite ordinary. He didn't spend his time composing or whatever. I think he spent his time entertaining his children, gardening, that kind of stuff. He spent a lot of time actually building model aeroplanes. The boys were interested in model aeroplanes, and he spent a lot of time researching ailerons and those rubber-powered things you wind up 900 times, and things with glow plug engines, tiny little petrol engines that you send them off. And apparently he was rather successful at it because they go down to Port Meadow, the big park in Oxford, and he had to write the family's name and address on the side of the fuselage in case the thing flew out of sight. So obviously his aileron research was quite successful. So basically, he liked odd jobs around the house. He laid floors in the house and put down new vinyl floors and did painting. So his hobbies were, I ought to say also he played the violin. I mean, he played that early on. Isaiah Berlin, he said he didn't play it particularly well, but he could have done. And he played it enough to practice some of the easy Bach sonatas and partitas, which he played at night. I think there were complaints from undergraduates about the amount of violin playing going on in his room. And as he wanted to complain about the noise they were making, he gave up the violin and largely took up the recorder again. Although with George Picture, he said he agreed 10 years later to take up the violin again. They did some violin and piano stuff. And actually, George Picture was a good pianist, said, "Austin, for someone who hadn't played for 15 years, he played quite well and could manage Corelli and Handel sonatas." So he had some musical accomplishments. And he was good at drawing, actually, now I come to think about it. In the 1930s, yes, sorry.
That's an ordinary.
I say ordinary, and I now suddenly realise that's not true. That he was rather good. I think they traced, but he drew some very amusing pictures of schoolgirls to amuse his younger sister. And actually, he was employed, the Oxford Dramatic Society. He did the covers for some of their programmes about Greek plays. So he was quite a good hand at drawing as well. So I'll revise what I said about him being ordinary. He was good at drawing. He was quite good at music. And he had all these other sort of, all these other pastimes you'd expect of a family man in the 50s, basically. Thank you. Yes. There's one here. Just need the microphone. Over here?
Maybe first here in the front, and then after that in the back.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in the corner.
Let's keep it short.
Yes.
You said that he went to America in 55 and loved it. European intellectuals visiting America in the 50s tended not to be terribly complimentary. So what was it that he loved about it? Is it just the excellent universities or something wider about the culture?
I think it was definitely something wider. I mean, you have to remember that Austin had grown up in very unusual times. In the first half of the 20th century in England was not a good time to be an adult. Basically, he's 3 and the First World War happens. There's, many people are injured and killed. there's the flu pandemic, there's the depression of the there's you know, the terrible political circumstances of the 1930s, there's the Second World War with the rationing and all its privations. And rationing actually went on until 1954 in England, and it was worse after the war than it was during the war. Bread, for example, was rationed until 54. So he'd grown up in very straitened, terrible economic times, and suddenly he goes off to Eisenhower's America, which had been obviously bad, you know, in the 1930s, but in the 1950s, you know, the war had more production. It was booming. I looked up the statistics, and in 1960, America was 6% of the world's population, but 40% of its GDP. You know, unbelievable amounts of wealth. And so Austin goes across. I don't think he is. He likes the universities. He thinks they're wonderful, but he's not particularly impressed by American philosophy. He thinks they've got completely the wrong idea. You know, they're doing this quasi-scientific Quine stuff, and he's not interested in that. But he says, you know, the place. He says there's this thing called a supermarket. And what you do is you go in, and there's just meat and fish and, you know, things you just hadn't seen in England for years. Yeah. And, and they pack it for you, and they take it down to your car. You know, the whole paragraph, he's delighted by this. He says, you know, the trains, you know, they're really warm and they're comfortable, and they go at 60 and 70 miles an hour, you know. And he says, people's houses, you know. He said, I stayed in a spare room in Yale, and it had 4 lamps in it. 4, you know, can you believe it? A guest room with 4 lamps. So he's absolutely, and then they're all terribly friendly, you know, you know, which obviously the English aren't. They say, oh, you must come round sometime, and never specify. Whereas the Americans say, come in now, you know. And so he's overwhelmed by the wealth, he's overwhelmed by the kind of friendliness and openness, and he's overwhelmed by the weather. You know, he actually goes off, when he was at Harvard, he went off to Berkeley. And he said, you know, lemon groves, and it's you know, it's sort of 25 degrees centigrade all the time. And it was basically Americans and America completely softened him. I mean, I said he was a terrifying individual around Oxford. In America, it's different. And it's very interesting that basically the people he was closest to were American graduate students. They loved him, he loved them, he thought it was great. In America, the Americans loved him, he loved them, he thought it was great. And a guy called Morton White wrote a memoir where he said, which he quotes a letter he'd written at the time saying, you know, Austin is going down a storm at Harvard. You know, I think the case must be that that he's a very different man from in Oxford. Oxford only seemed to know the suit of armour, whereas somehow in America, the man has emerged from that suit of armour and is talking with graduate students, he's going to conferences, he's doing all this, you know, it's amazing. So, and he got lots of American offers. Harvard wanted him to come and stay because he was such a hit. Berkeley began to offer him huge quantities of money to go there. He desperately wanted to go because he basically thought, this is a place I'm going to blossom. Not only philosophically, I've got new things to say that they don't know, but personally, you know, it's just so different from chilly, you know, inhibited 1950s England, you know, with some of the worst winters on record and all the rest of it. Unfortunately, his wife was opposed because she was quite a timid person anyway, but she had 5 siblings, all in England, and all her friends were in England. She just really couldn't imagine a life for herself in America and didn't want to go. And by the time this was decided, Austin had more or less died, you know. And so America it wasn't really the ideas, it was the place, and it was the people, and the weather that just blew him away. And I mean, there's a case by a cat called Rom Harry who I interviewed, who said I was teaching in 1959 or whatever in a quad at Balliol, and Austin always wore a dark suit, not very well pressed dark suit and a tie and so on. And he said I was suddenly teaching in this quadrangle in Balliol, and with a group of undergraduates, and we couldn't believe it, but Austin entered the quad wearing a white with pale blue striped seersucker suit. And people just couldn't believe the transformations. And I also know that his daughter said he took out a subscription to the New Yorker. Basically, you know, here was a guy who was just thought America was fantastic. Not probably, but at some sort of visceral, sub-intellectual level, it just hit him. And it was the culture of the place. He just thought it was, you know, you wouldn't hear a bad word about America. You know, somebody complained about the cooking, he just wasn't having it. Fantastic. You know.
We have a few more questions.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure there's an endless reservoir. In the back there, in the corner. Yes.
Hi. So I'm currently reading The Freedom of the Will by Jonathan Edwards, and he keeps using ordinary language, philosophy, methodology to say, okay, you've made mistakes in your reasoning about the freedom of the will.
Yes.
But the freedom, questions about freedom of the will have been presented during the course of this talk as, shall we say, somewhat opposed to the ethos of ordinary language philosophy. Is there really this opposition between something more abstract like freedom of the will and ordinary language philosophy?
No. I mean, clearly, philosophers have always, as I've said with Socrates, have always used ordinary language philosophy and have said, you're misusing this term. I suppose in ordinary language philosophy it's largely the emphasis. I mean, actually, Austin on freedom of the will is quite interesting because Austin basically disliked it because he thought it was a sort of ossified philosophical question that people have been talking about for centuries and basically got nowhere with. So he said, why don't we just park these traditional problems for a time and look at some other stuff where we're more likely to make progress. Let's start with something simple, then move to the really difficult cases. So it's largely a question of emphasis, but he didn't particularly like those old-fashioned questions. The other thing to say is that Austin thought the traditional problem of will had been miscast. Usually it's put in terms of causality and science. Basically, if you knew what every quark and a neutron and an atom were doing in the human body and the environment, you could predict exactly what the human being would be doing in 10 years' time or whatever. Austin thought that was the wrong view, the wrong way to think about it. Austin said the real problem with free will is the notion of responsibility. We're quite happy that in some cases humans are responsible for what they do and in others not. And for example, we have ways of mitigating responsibility. That hence his title of his paper, A Plea for Excuses, where we say things like, I was pushed, I was drunk, I was coerced, I was gaslighted. There are all sorts of ways you can mitigate your responsibility for something. And Austin said, the real interest of the problem of free will is responsibility and the kind of reasons we give why someone is not responsible or has reduced responsibility for their actions. It's a much more kind of ordinary language, or the thing that arises every day in schools and prisons and all the rest of it, rather than this very abstract problem about, physical science and predictability, which Austin thought was different. How convincing that is, I'm not sure. It was a topic on which Austin was quite touchy. If people started questioning that view, that it's about responsibility rather than causality, he could be quite cutting about it. And as in the example of the pathetic little rigmarole, that was a presentation about free will. So it was something he was, he was not totally happy with. But you're quite right. Obviously, philosophers have always used ordinary language as one method. I think the difference is that Austin was suspicious of traditional questions and pushed the ordinary language stuff much harder than other people expected. And finally, this point about he thought free will had been miscast and the real interest lay in responsibility rather than scientific causality.
Thank you. There was a question here, here as well, in the front. Here, on the bench.
Yes.
I have lots of questions, but I'll keep it short. Did Austin ever meet Alan Turing? And what was his influence long-term possibly on military intelligence gathering? What made him special in terms
Okay. Austin certainly went across occasionally to Bletchley Park. That's true, where Alan Turing worked. Whether they actually met, I don't know. I'm really not sure. I've recently read Hodges' biography of Turing, and there's no hint of Austin in that. It's possible they saw one another in corridors. I've no evidence of any closer connection than that. What was Austin's long-term influence on intelligence? Well, this is quite interesting, I think, because America realized, it's very interesting about America that at the beginning of the Second World War, it didn't have a foreign intelligence service at all. And then the disaster of Pearl Harbor occurred. They were completely taken aback. Now, apparently the reason why they didn't have a developed foreign intelligence service was some American Secretary of State in the 1920s said, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. They thought it was an ungentlemanly way to behave, to spy on people. That's very understandable. So then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened, and they thought, perhaps we'd better get a bit more organized about this. So there's a guy called Donovan, who I dare say, who set up a sort of, a group that did foreign intelligence and stuff. But even after the war, but the British were, because they'd been at it much longer, they nearly always led intelligence operations in the Second World War. Austin had an American deputy. It's interesting that Austin wasn't a deputy to an American, for example. And it's partly England's power in the Second World War that it had, they were supplying intelligence stuff to the Americans. After the war, they decided, well, look, we better set up the CIA, effectively, because we need a foreign intelligence service. So they set up the CIA, which did initially very, very badly, and they managed not to notice the start of the Korean War, for example. That caught them by surprise. So Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, was appointed to take over the CIA and turn it into an efficient and functioning intelligence organization. Now, Bedell Smith was Austin's boss. Most of Bedell Smith's information for 15 months of the war came from Austin's G2 unit in Schaff on German order of battle. He was supplying, he met Bedell Smith, often was supplying him with information. And that was an incredibly efficient organization. So when Bedell Smith takes over, his idea of what a really efficient intelligence organization looks like is Austin's outfit. That's one thing. Also, later on, the CIA, much later, I think in the early 80s, was taken over by a guy called William Casey, who became director of CIA. He had seen Austin at work in London in the 1940s and writes about his memoirs, saying, I went around to Austin's place and my God, the amount of information they're dealing is absolutely staggering and how well organized it is. So at least two very influential directors of the CIA knew Austin's work directly, and he was their paradigm of what a really efficient intelligence service looks like. So I think. And there's also a man called Sherman Kent, whose reforms to the CIA look remarkably similar to the way Austin was running some things as well. So I think there's quite a lot of influence on the way the CIA was set up and reformed and run directly from Austin's method. So I think he did actually have some sort of knock-on effect in intelligence directly. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. So, towards the end of Austin's career, you talk about him looking into truth, and you say that was kind of a dead end to some extent. And then later on, you mentioned something about, I think it was sound meaning symbolism. Is that the term? Yeah. And I know that he was quite influenced by Chomsky later on in syntactic structures. But then, rather than dig into all those things in detail, obviously he died quite early. What's his take on his own philosophical contribution towards the end? It feels like he was kind of thrashing around towards the end.
I think that's true. I mean, I should say that he was quite an influence on Chomsky when Chomsky was very young. And Chomsky was absolutely happy to acknowledge this and said, I did a lot of talking with Austin and I was very impressed by him. How much he was influenced by Chomsky, I'm not so sure, because syntactic structures was the topic of his Saturday morning group in the term before his death, when he was already becoming ill. And Mary Warnock said, we made no progress with it really at all, much. So Chomsky's influence on him, I think, is rather less. Do you want to say something about sound symbolism and that kind of stuff? I mean, just to make a general point that Austin is an ordinary language philosophy, and ordinary language philosophy is a method. It applies to all areas of philosophy. If it's ethics or logic or metaphysics, you apply ordinary language to it. It's a method. I think as Austin goes through the 50s, he becomes less interested in ordinary language, Oxford ordinary language philosophy, then he becomes interested in the philosophy of language. And the philosophy of language is, how language functions. How does speech work? How do we communicate in speech? And actually, it's a subject which didn't really exist before the 50s. It's one of those subjects like the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of psychology and the philosophy of action that ordinary language philosophy created. And so I think we see a move from ordinary language philosophy to philosophy of language, first in speech acts, and secondly in the sound symbolism stuff. Sound symbolism, I've just explained, is where you think that the connection between the sound or look of the referring expression bears some natural similarity to the thing referred to. So it's utterly conventional in linguistics to say, the sound of a word is arbitrary. In German they call it Hund, in French it's chien, in English it's dog. It doesn't matter. Austin began to think, largely that's true. Of course, you could have a language which functions like that perfectly efficiently, where there's just a purely arbitrary link-up between the sound of the word and the thing itself. But he was actually interested in something called clustering, which is that it tend to find that words in a language tend to have similar sounds according to how similar their meaning is. For example, in English, GL words, for example, many of them, scores of them, refer to light and reflected light. So glare, glitz, glister, gleam, glow, gloaming, all those kind of words. They refer to, and some of them only have a metaphorical connection, like gloom and so forth, but GL words are very predominant. Similarly, words that end in IGGLE tend to express rapid, arbitrary motion. Wiggle, jiggle, squiggle, all those kind of words, they're the same. Words which end in UMP tend to be low-lying objects of a rounded sort and the sounds associated with them. So chump, rump, stump, frump, lump, dump, all those kind of they're low-lying things. And Austin was very, very interested in this. And actually, portmanteau words are a kind of clustering, because you just take, and it allows you to guess the meaning of new words and project new words very easily. And you often find them at the cutting edge of language. So Austin was very interested, just to take a contemporary example, nobody needed to have the word Brexit explained to them. You didn't say, well, it's it's in Britain and that kind of stuff, because it's obvious. It comes from the Greek Grexit, as people point out. But you can just guess it. And suddenly, which words catch on? Well, there were and Austin gives us an example. There were various popular names for the V1 and V2 German secret weapons. They were initially referred to as like V1s or divers by the British. The Germans referred to them by the code name cherry stones. But then other words began to emerge from the general public, like buzz bomb, doodlebug. And those are the names everybody remembers. And why do those words catch on? Well, buzz bomb sounds a bit like satisfyingly onomatopoeia. It's got alliteration, buzz bomb. And the buzzing sounds like buzzing, which is the noise the bomb makes. Doodlebug makes it sound like a kind of annoying insect, and that kind of belittles it. So Austin was interested in this kind of cutting edge of language. How do these things catch on? So he got interested in this topic, which all linguists of a sound sort, and Chomsky actually told me he thought it was ridiculous. He says, I hope you don't publish about it. I think the whole thing's dire death. It's a complete embarrassment. But I thought, no, this is interesting. And it's talked about in Plato's Cratylus. Leibniz said, well, of course, in ordinary language, it could be the case that words have no bearing to their referent at all. But in actual fact, if you look at ordinary languages, and this is language invariant. In German, it has lots of words, kn, which suggests something rounded and so forth. So he got very interested in this topic, which is another step in his philosophical development, moving away from ordinary language philosophy and rather traditional problems towards the philosophy of language, and actually all the things he hated previously, like theories, for example, like jargon, for example, like things he worked out by himself rather than with other people, which is true with things like speech notes. He didn't seem to discuss it particularly with anybody. So he's moving back to a more traditional conception of what we need as a theory, and instead of being an Oxford ordinary language philosopher, he's become an international philosopher of language, which is something quite different. And I think had he lived, he would have been like Grice. If he wanted, I hope his wish would have come true, that he could have gone to California and he could have worked on sound symbolism. And that particular hybrid of linguistics and philosophy that developed in the States under Chomsky and Ziff and Zeno Wendler and all these guys who are philosophers but also technical linguists. And I'm sure Austin would have had some major important contributions to make to them.
Great. Thank you, Mark, so much. I think it's time to slowly wrap up. Are there any quick burning questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I actually ended the book with a section about why you might have been particularly inclined to get cancer. And I did actually quite a lot of research on lung cancer, which was a fairly sobering piece of research, at least to me, I can tell you, because apparently if you get lung cancer, physicians in the 19th century were told, you'll probably see one case of lung cancer in a lifetime. But actually, lung cancer is now a pretty common cancer. It was even more common. And something like 83% of cancers are caused by the fact that somebody smoked. So Austin did smoke before and after the war. He smoked both pipe and cigarettes quite regularly. I talked to his sister, who was a doctor, about why he might have got lung cancer. And she made a point that even when he didn't smoke, he was in small underground rooms with other people 14 hours a day who were smoking 60 a day. So he was passively smoking all the time. That's just how people were in the Second World War. Finally, I think there are two other, this is not confirmed medical science, but there is some reason to suppose very long-term stress might be a contributor towards cancer. Low vitamin D, which when you're working away from sunlight can conceivably cause cancer. So there could be 4 reasons why there were many people in Oxford who smoked much more than he did, like Anscombe and Eyre and Dummett, who smoked all the time. They only stopped smoking when they were asleep, But Austin, there are at least 4 reasons why he might have. The tension during the war must have been unbearable. You're 33 years old and you're in charge of D-Day intelligence, the whole thing about the coast. And you know that Well, it was 156,000 troops and 175,000 ships' crews are going across, and you've told them where to land and what to expect. If you're wrong, you know, the responsibility must be appalling. I also noticed that there's quite a lot of Austin's contemporaries, just a man called Dunbabin, people with very heroic wars who just sort of dropped dead in the 50s for no particular reason. They just sort of had heart attacks. And it could be, and I originally tried to argue in the book, though I eventually cut this section, that he was a long-term victim of the Second World War. It might have been all that passive smoking, all that responsibility, and all that working out of daylight could have been contributory factors as well as his smoking. But smoking was undoubtedly the major one.
Thank you. Thank you, Rudolph. Will you say the final word?
Let's thank Mark with an applause. And this is his book that you can also see, of course, on the SPAU 25 website. We'll now slowly amble out, but if you still have, maybe more personal questions, I think Mark is open to them as well, right? Or suggestions. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
I think
you can buy a book there. I mean, you can find all the information.
There's a voucher over there that gets you, I think, 30% off.
Yes.
So if you possibly like to buy a copy of the book, take one of those vouchers and you'll get massive off. I can guarantee that you get a lot of book for your money.
Yeah. Thank you.